Thank you, Anita. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. I'm very pleased to be here with you this afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. I'm Professor of Social Work at the University of Hertfordshire, and I'm also a member of the ERIS network, and also I'm very proud to be a citizen of the European Union, and I very much hope that I will be able to say that again this time next year. I'm also chair of the research committee for the Joint University Council for Social Work Education, which represents universities across the UK. And what we'll be looking at this afternoon are some of the issues currently around social policy and social work as they affect practice, but even more importantly, how they affect service users and carers in our health and social care systems in England at the moment. I can't do the whole of the UK because it's very different in different parts of the UK. So, for example, at my time of life, I should be trying to move to Scotland because they have a much better social care system in Scotland than they do in England. But we'll see if they let me in at some point. Okay, so we can have debates about all of these things, but what kind of welfare regime does England have at the moment? If we look at the macro landscape of welfare, I would argue that we are moving very much towards a residual and liberal model of social welfare. We're moving away from state provision of services towards marketisation. You've already heard of some of these concepts from our previous speakers. To put it in context though, I will come back later to the definition of social work from the International Federation of Social Workers, which has an emphasis on social justice, on human rights, and I believe all of us should be looking at this definition to help us think about how we frame what role social work has in our changing conditions, both socially, politically, that's three things actually, socially, politically, and economically in our different countries. But I think the key feature about social work that's always attracted me and always been important to me is about the long tradition that we have in working with disadvantaged, troubled, and sometimes troublesome groups and individuals. And of course, there are many social works around the globe in something like 125 countries. Somewhere it's been in place for over 120 years, depending how you define it. And in some countries where it was not allowed to develop and or permitted for various reasons, and where it's now developing. One of our recent projects we've got from my university is some Chinese universities. So it's interesting about having debates about some of these areas in terms of that project. So, I would argue that social work is unique in that it looks at the person in a holistic way and the person in their situation. I have debates with others, talk with my students about this is a crucial part of social work. If I go to a physiotherapist is very good about helping me with my knee. A social worker should be interested from my emotional life, from my social life, to my rights. We cover a whole range, which is wonderful and great, but maybe is part of our problem as well, about representing what we do and maybe the status that we have sometimes in our different country. So I think a key factor in social work is about valuing each individual as a person of worth. And we'll come back to this as we look at it in some of the other elements that we do in relation to, example, working with asylum seekers in England. And in addition, no matter what that person may have done, if not condoning their behaviours or attitudes. So, some key areas that I think are there for us to look at the moment. So this is the main list, okay? We'll go into more detail. There are lots of slides. Don't worry about it too much, please. I tend to do it as like a handout. So some of the detail on these slides I'll be passing over. But if you're interested to look at them further, please email me. I'll send you them slides so you can see them in that detail. So, key highlights, I think, is that issue about the mixed economy, the retreat of the welfare state with new private providers. Personalisation of services linked to consumerism and individualised packages of care, a crucial element. Okay. It's moving on my screen, but not up on there. Excellent. Thank you, Anita, for letting me know. Otherwise, people say,
this is all I can do about it.
Yep, okay, let's...
It will be like this, maybe. It's not working. Okay.
Okay, if I turn the screen around...
Which one is it?
You can maybe look at the... Yes? Yeah.
Which one is it? The 6th one?
Yeah, that's where we should be. Yeah. Let's go back.
It's not now.
No. Okay.
I thought that it... Pavla, prosím tě, můžeš zavolat toho Vitu? Že to nefunguje to.
If I use this one here, maybe. No, it's not doing it either.
Maybe switch off and switch on. That sometimes it's working.
Okay.
Just start again. Will you do that? I can't. It's not working as well.
Okay, my apologies. I will try and read from my notes, but they're rather small, so maybe I need the magnifying glass, so I will see what I can manage, okay? So key areas, highlights. The mixed economy of welfare and retreat of the welfare state. Personalisation of services linked to consumerism, and I think it's really interesting, these sorts of events. There are a number of things I've heard this morning that have made me think and want... Yeah?
Mike. Translation.
Okay? Because normally at things people say I'm too loud. So it's kind of nice to know people I'm too quiet. Okay. Which links back to some of the things we heard this morning about individualisation. Now, the big thing I think in our English system is moving away from communitarian approaches, community development approaches, to individualisation, which in some ways is very good because there's been criticism over the years. If I'm someone with disabilities, a social worker will see me, they will say, we've got this on offer, we've got that on offer, you may have that. The idea now is it's not that way at all. It should be an assessment of my needs, and then we try and work out something about how they can be met, okay? So it's not about what the agency provides, it should be about my personal needs. It doesn't quite always work like that, but that's the idea and that's the way it's working. So in terms of Jan Keller's ideas about individualisation of 6 different levels, it's quite good in some ways, but the problem is this is all linked to a much, much bigger agenda about moving away from society and community development through to it's down to me. And we'll come back to them in a moment about the effects of someone who I know you'll love to hear about, which is Mrs. Thatcher. Okay, I think you know the name Mrs. Thatcher? Yes, okay, we'll come back to her in just a moment because I'm sorry to say the impact she had on all this has been absolutely enormous in terms of the big picture, right through to what's happening now. Then there's another part of that, which is something I'm very involved in and a great advocate for, which is about empowerment of service users and carers in terms of policy and in terms of practice and my own care needs, if I have them. And that's particularly been the case in mental health services and looked after children work. So it's got a real part to play, really important, but there are some criticisms of that as well. We'll come back to that in a short while. Care management was mentioned this morning. Interestingly, we're starting to move away from the idea of care management. Well, that's been very important in terms of some of the policies and practices in recent years. Again, fitting with all of this is we have a great emphasis now on safeguarding. So if I'm being abused as a service user or carer, we have policies and laws in place so that agencies have a legal responsibility to make sure I'm being protected. That's been in place for quite a long time for children and young people, but since 2014, in our Care Act, it's now become something for adults as well. But again, this is about individual rights in relation to our systems. So the whole emphasis of what we're doing is individualised. That links with something called risk assessment and risk management. Big feature in our system at the moment about targeting of resources and service users. So I might have a social worker who will come along if I have needs, who will do an assessment of me. They will go back to their office. There'll be a panel of people who sit around saying, should this person get a service? Should that person get a service? So it's about resource allocation, and it's about gatekeeping of money and resources. Some of the other good things we've seen about social work is the development in terms of anti-discriminatory and anti-oppressive practice. And I'm actually very proud of that from social work in our country. We have been the leaders in that area to a great degree. And sometimes we've had some of the media who have really given us a hard time about this because they think we do too much about this and should ignore these sorts of things. Okay? The growth of professionalisation we've heard about a bit. So I will cover a little bit in terms of the professional regulation. Thank you. So in terms of professional regulation, but also what we've heard about in presentations earlier in relation to deprofessionalisation at the same time. Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Okay.
Well done.
Okay. We've heard about managerialism. So this is the idea that I can be a big manager in Aldi, okay, and I can go along and manage a social work agency just as well, probably better than a social worker. This is all about being a good manager. It's not necessarily knowing about all the key issues. It's managing. It's generic. So that's been a key feature in terms of our social work agencies in recent years. As part of all this as well, we have a big regime, and I don't know if other continental countries have this, please tell me, is inspection and regulation. We have whole armies of people, and I use the word advisedly because that's how the agencies will see it, whole armies of people who will go along and inspect them, be they in the NGO sector or in the statutory sector provided by local government or central government sometimes, to say, are you meeting our standards? Again, this can be seen as a good thing, or it could be seen as a way of the state controlling how social care is viewed and how it's delivered. We'll come back to some of those in a while. But if we think about this as part of theory, I think both for professionals about how we are registered at the moment, which I think is a good thing that we are registered. I'm a registered social worker. I can be struck off and I cannot call myself a social worker if I've breached my codes of practice or done something wrong. So it's a protected title. If I call myself a social worker and I'm not registered, had the proper training, I've committed a criminal offence in my country. So part of that is Foucault's idea of the disciplinary gaze. So I'd locate quite a lot of this in about how the state uses different mechanisms, not necessarily very open. Forget George Orwell and 1984, that's all far too obvious. There are many, many more subtle ways of government having control of how they think social work and social care and health should be happening. Othering and labelling. We have some big problems, particularly in terms of refugees and asylum seekers. And one of the reasons many people think that Britain voted to leave the European Union is about immigration, one of the key features. And it's othering in terms of ideas. Those people are different from us. They are bad people. We shouldn't have them near us. I know that sounds simplistic, but this is the discourse which takes place in England at the moment from many groups. Very important, I won't go into too much detail, but interagency and interprofessional working. And of course, one of the best books you can read about that if you want to is, it's Littlechild and Smith. We wrote a book on it a few years ago. And new models of delivery outside the traditional local authority model. Now, this is very important. This is a particular group, it's a private organisation, which took over children and family social work in a London borough, with the idea that local authorities are full of bureaucracy, they're not good at employing social workers. So the Hackney model is a private organisation, and all of their looked after children, the services are provided by the Hackney model. Well, two people, Goodman and Trowler, set it up at the time. This is happening more and more in social work. So it's not under local authority control, it's not under local councillors who I can complain to if I don't think my care is working very well, because it's an independent, contracted organisation. Okay, now, I think England have actually given the world quite a few good things over the centuries. The World Wide Web. Okay, that's not a bad one. David Beckham. Oh, okay, right. And cuisine, roast beef and fish and chips. Fantastic. I mean, now, the other thing is our gift to the world, or certainly to Europe, I think maybe, from what we've been hearing today, is Margaret Thatcher. And famously, in 1987, she said in an interview for a magazine, "They are casting their problems at society." These are poor and disadvantaged people, by the way, in case you'd missed that bit. And as you know, there's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And no government can do anything except through people, and people must look after themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves and then also to look after our neighbours. Now, it's hard to tell you how influential that has been since then. The way she developed the model and processes has had a direct effect, I would argue, as to where we are now. For better or for worse. In fact, she didn't like social work. She used to refer to us as socialist workers. And Socialist Worker was a far-left political party who were seen as being very destructive, and social workers were thought to be part of this far-left group. So we were on the target of Mrs. Thatcher. She set up a government inquiry in 1980 into social work, making it clear, because it was independent, you understand, that we were part of something called a nanny state, if people know what that means. You know, you get looked after too much. If you look after people too much, they become dependent. They are not producing wealth. They're not useful people. Right. The report identified three key approaches. The safety net approach, emphasising informal networks and minimal state intervention provision. The welfare state approach, which has been pretty much what happened post-Second World War with the idea of comprehensive services. And then the community approach, that people have the potential to care for each other if power is devolved to them. And the social worker's role is then to support those informal networks and develop them where they are weak. The majority of the committee members went for the third approach. But one person, Professor Pinker from the London School of Economics, went for the casework model, the individually directed one, okay? And what transpired from that was Mrs. Thatcher didn't manage to get rid of social work, which I suppose is a good thing, but she did have it on her agenda, really and honestly, but it was this second view, Professor Pinker, that kind of was influential from Mrs. Thatcher's views coming through to where we are now. So, away from the community-based work and individually therapeutically based work into case management, risk assessment and targeted services rather than universal ones, with eligibility criteria for access becoming really important rather than universal services. It's a way of rationing. So I'd argue that we're moving towards more and more towards the residual and liberal USA model, with means testing, minimal state intervention as far as possible. Okay. What we also see, and it's not a government policy, about creeping privatisation of the National Health Service. Okay? This is really important because the social workers working in the National Health Service, but also the joining up increasingly of health and care services within England particularly. Okay? So, we've got more and more contracts being awarded to private companies to run elements of the service, whilst the privatisation of social care is not so hidden, as we shall see. Key element behind all of this is the level and nature of inequalities and poverty, with social insecurity becoming more of a feature of how people have to experience their lives, particularly when they have areas of need, particularly in relation to employment, for example. With a number of people I work with who have mental health problems, there's been real pressure on them to get jobs the way they have changed the criteria. In fact, there's evidence that several people have taken their own lives because of the pressure being put on that they should be back in work and they can't be seen as not being able to do work at that point in time. So, the major area of employment and views about that, not only in terms of income, but what it means for people as part of their care needs maybe. So, move away from welfare state services to ration services. The effects of poverty and disadvantage, because that's who mostly social workers work with, been exacerbated by things such as the lack of affordable housing, which the government has actually acknowledged in the last week or two in England and has promised to invest in, because people are homeless, not because of anything else other than they can't afford anywhere to live. And these are people with young children, okay, who are homeless, and unstable employment. Because our government loves to say that we've got a high level of employment. It depends how you define it, because many of those people are on the minimum wage and often on 0-hour contracts. So I am deemed to be employment when I might not have any work at all during that week or that month. Apparently, I'm employed. Okay. Since 2006, 60% rise in the number of people moving repeatedly between work and unemployment. And that's between 75 and 2014. The real hourly wages of middle income full-time employees doubled, while wages below the middle typically rose by only about 80%. So what I'm trying to point out is the disparities that there have been and still are, and that affects what we do as social workers. A benefit cap of £20,000 for families has been imposed on families irrespective of how many children they have to support, which actually affects the rights of the children. We may have other views about that, but there are children now, more children living in poverty and disadvantage because of this. And the discourse in the media amongst politicians was, these are families who have lots of children, they expect to live on the state, we've got to do something to stop it. The othering that I was talking about, which I think is a real problem in a number of areas of England at present, is about refugees and asylum seekers. There's been a backlash. I know it's not just in England, I'm afraid. There's a backlash from certain groups in terms of this othering I was talking about. That all the problems of our society are to do with asylum seekers and immigrants. So, if we get rid of all these people, everything will be okay, won't it? No. So, we see that particularly in treatment of young people, where there have had to be court cases taken by non-governmental organisations such as the Howard League, where children have been taken away from their parents whilst awaiting a decision about leave to stay. And there's a court order to say that's inhuman and it shouldn't be happening. Okay? We're seeing something now in other ways. I can go into detail if you want me to other times, maybe a bit too much detail at the moment. Again, there's a really good chapter on that in a book by Simpson and Littlechild in 2009. Okay, this is the marketing thing. Now, so all this move towards privatisation, what's happened about it? What are the figures? What might it mean? Well, actually, it sometimes doesn't work very well. So, if I work for a local authority, or in the health service come to that, I have an amount of money that I can spend on my service, okay? If I'm not able to meet that service, because I've not got enough money, I can't go along to the government and say, you've not given me enough money, take it back. But if I'm a private provider, I can and I do. And this partly relates to, I am actually on board of directors of several non-profit making social agencies. And we have contracts to do work, for example, with young people, people with mental health problems, from funders such as local authorities. However, bit of a problem there. Don't know if it's true in other countries, but as a board member, I have a legal duty to meet the needs of the company first. Okay? If the crunch really comes, as a director, it's not about the service users or carers, it's about the company. Okay, so a private company got a contract to run a hospital in Cambridgeshire, Hinchingbrook, in 2013. It decided that actually the money wasn't enough, and it said, we don't want the contract anymore, take it back. Okay, so it made some profits from that during that period, although they say don't get enough money, but it's not enough now, take it back, leaving it in chaos. We've had the same in social care services. Private providers in Hertfordshire, my own county, the county had to terminate the contract in 2017 that were paying money for because the service was so consistently bad. People know Virgin Airlines? Yes, do you know Richard Branson? Fabulous guy, pays no tax at all in the UK. Anyway, let's leave that as it is at the moment. But Virgin Trains, they had to have their contract taken back last year because they were providing such a poor service. They couldn't do what they said they'd do in their contract. Okay? Carillion was a huge company providing public services through from roads, through to prisons, through to lots of work in the social care sector, went bust earlier this year. Huge company, leaving lots of debts. Who picks them up? Oh, it's me actually, it's a taxpayer. This works well, doesn't it? I've got that. So, now I'm not trying to say all works badly every time, but I think the risks are such that if I'm in a local authority, I've got a duty to provide something good with what I've got. It's not a level playing field from what I can work out in terms of private contracts. So I can make money out of it as a company, but then fail. And do you know what? Nothing happens about it. These companies get other contracts from the government. Just question why. Really? Okay. So care of the elderly was open to private companies in the 1990s. So research from the London School of Economics found that 70% of home care is provided by the independent sector today, and is worth £1.5 billion. The figure was just 2% of that in 1992. Oh, meanwhile, the Virgin Company was awarded almost £2 billion of NHS contracts between 2013 and 2018. I just asked the question, that's all. That's against the backdrop of actually local authorities needing to gain the cheapest services possible. Professor Tony Travers, again from the London School of Economics, there's been cuts in local authority spending of 30% due to austerity. It doesn't need to be austerity, it's a choice, by the way. It's not a given. But Tony Travers, acknowledged expert in this field, said cuts 30% since 2010, with major cuts made in children's services and adult care services. And these are just some examples of some councils recently have said, we can't do anything. We're going to do the absolute minimum under statutory legislation, but you know what? We can't even do that. This is those councils who are meant to be running, so we just can't do it. We've got no money left. In fact, we've got less than enough money left. Okay. All right, I've done that one. So, from a time in 1948 after the Second World War, the National Assistance Act and the National Health Service Act, a great move forwards towards welfare provision and health in a way that no one had known before. And it finally got rid of the Poor Law, which was, the Poor Law was from the 1600s, was meant to stop me if I'm poor trying to make a claim on the state, because the poorhouse was so terrible that I wouldn't want to go near it. And I actually worked with some people who were elderly who didn't want to go into residential care because they still had memories of the poorhouse and what it was like. They were petrified of going to residential care because of that. Okay, I'm going to pass over some of those things there. Okay, a major report from important organisations earlier this year about the need to increase just to keep health services where they are and social care services. Right, because we know, I'm going to go through the figures about how much we spend. I'm going to go over those fairly quickly now. About social care, what we've seen is actually a decrease over recent years. While there's been a very small increase, about 1% over the last few years, because of the increased need and demand, the spending equivalent has gone down by about 2.2% each year over the same period, whilst there's been an enormous increase in demand because we're all living longer. Okay? Again, I'm not going to go through some of those things there because I know I need to all be drilling her eyes into me any moment now. So, I'm going to go over some of these things. Lots of evidence in here about these things, about what's happening to social care in particular and the pressures on it, okay? Children's charities are saying the same sorts of things. The trade union Unison found that there have been spending cuts for youth services of 387 million since April 2010. And it's a very small, that's a large proportion of a very small pot. So we know these services are disappearing at an enormously quick rate. I'm going to go over that bit as well. There's stuff here if people want to look at it from an important group called Child Poverty Action Group. 1 in 5 households in the UK have an income below the poverty line after their housing costs are taken into account. 30% of children live in households below the poverty line when you take into account housing costs. Almost double the poverty rate for pensioners. 30% in one of the richest countries in the world. And the report sets out how in the 1970s and 80s income inequality in the UK widened rapidly and how the gap has remained wide ever since. So if people want the evidence of these things, it's here and it's in those reports which are referenced at the end of this. We know also that in terms of poverty and disadvantage, black families have that even more. So if you're a child in a black family, 43% chance you'll be living in poverty. I'm going to go over these fairly quickly as well. People can ask me about these if they want to, about the focus on child safeguarding. This is such a major feature now, and if a child dies, there are major reports, major things in the media, and because of that, some people would argue, many of our resources are now aimed at these sorts of risk situations. So there's an assessed risk, most of the resources go there. So in terms of preventative services, those are the things that are disappearing. So it's targeted based on a risk assessment. Is this the best way to do this? And the same is now happening to adult safeguarding. So our methods have included casework, very influential in the 1950s. So was community work, actually, around that time. Since then, things like systemic theory, family therapy and social learning theory became popular. In the 1970s, radical social work had as a basis Marxist and emancipatory theories. A couple of my colleagues from the UK might remember this. Jim, do you remember this? You're too young. Our colleague from Ireland, he's in Ireland now, he says he's too young to remember that. It's one of the good things about being so old that I can remember this. But for a time, there was a clear idea that social workers should be challenging the system, not working just with individuals, but challenging the system. That certainly isn't part of our discourse, I would argue, now. Okay? So we've gone on to more training-based work, such as parenting programs, task-centred approaches, which I quite like, but they're still individualised, cognitive behavioural therapy, and individualistic forms of interventions, which are growing particularly in mental health work. We have solution-focused models, which is good, but actually there's a bit of a problem in some child protection work when you're... Anyway, never mind, we'll talk about it another time. But the idea again is it's individualistic, all right? It's not communitarian, it's me and my service user working together on something. Okay. Austerity we've mentioned already. Organisations such as Sure Start, a major voluntary organisation working with disadvantaged families with children, more than 350 of those centres have closed down since 2010 because of austerity. Okay. So, how do we define questions of social problems and solutions to them? How much of our limited resources should we put into primary or secondary social work methods for the prevention of social exclusion, neglect and economic disadvantage and forms of abuse? Or is it better, more effective, more humane, whatever, to target communities, individuals, groups, families and children we believe may be at risk or when problems become apparent through schools, the police or referral to social services? One of the good things I think has happened, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm a great advocate for this and involved in research projects and various things, is about co-production between professionals, policymakers and service users. And there's some things happening about that which I think are very valuable. Happy to go into that in more detail at the end of this session with anyone, because I think it's really important that we start to say, as professionals, we only know so much, but we've got lots of power. We need now to start sharing that power with service users. Because you know what? In most cases, they know what they need, while we think we know what they need. That may be based on all sorts of prejudices, on all sorts of attributions. So we need to check that out with the people we actually work with. Okay. However, some people have said, do you know what, that's fine, Brian, but it's just a way of getting us to take responsibility for our own problems, isn't it? So if it's not done well, it can feel as though we are saying, do you know what, you need to come up with the solutions, which is okay on some levels, but there needs to be ways of doing that. Otherwise it feels someone's disadvantaged, it's been put on me again to provide those solutions. I've already mentioned about anti-oppressive practice, happy to come about that again, interprofessional practice. Okay, a few words about professionalisation and social work qualifying education, and then I promise I'll finish. Okay, until 2017, social work qualifying education was delivered entirely within universities, either at bachelor or master's level, okay? And a key feature of that, I think probably more than in other continental European countries, is the emphasis the government have placed, and it is the government who wanted this, and put that in through the professional regulating bodies, because we can't run a qualifying course in any university unless they lay hands upon us and say, yes, you're meeting all our requirements. And the issue of what those requirements are and what's in them and what they say social work about is absolutely key with what we've been talking about today. So, key element of that is, you universities, you're a whole bunch of academics, that's interesting, but you don't really know about practice, do you? So what's going to happen is 50% of your course you will spend in practice placements, okay? So you'll learn what really is going on. So all these academics can talk about this, but you'll really learn what's happening here, okay? So 50% of our course. And students have to pass 30 days of assessed practice, if you like, before they can go into those numbers of days placements. It's normally 200, can be more, normally 200. What's changed in recent years is part of this discourse from the government that social work's not doing very well and social work education in universities doing even more poorly, is they have intervened. And oddly enough, they're giving some money to it. Okay? So there are two programs which have come along. They're master's programs, because what they want to see, rightly or wrongly, is that the social work profession becomes attractive to high quality graduates. This is not my term, this is their term. So two programs. One is Step Up to Social Work, where they select people from top performing universities, again, I quote from their documents, and they come 14 months, they're employed by an agency, the university provides the input to get to the qualification. I have to give a declaration of interest, because my university, we have the contract for one of those, okay? So I have to say that. The other one is Frontline, which is a slightly different kettle of fish, I would say, but it was set up by the government, and it's the same type of thing, only it's based on the idea of motivational interviewing and psychologically based interventions. So it's not very generic, it's based on very certain ideas about how we work individually with service users and carers. Again, they get paid an amount. What's happened with Frontline recently is they were with a University of Bedfordshire, who ran the programme for them. They're a private organisation. Since last year, they run it all themselves. So we have a private organisation doing everything for the social work students, and the University of Bedfordshire runs an exam board to say, yes, they've done the things they're meant to do. This is a very significant development for social work education and universities in England. And the government have now put out a contract to have even more of our qualifying students going through these routes. Okay, so, as I mentioned earlier about social work regulation, I, as a registered social worker, have some codes of practice I have to work under. I can't go through them all now. Happy to talk about it another time. Happy to send them to you. Happy to have a debate with you about them. But basically, I would argue they go with what we're talking about at the moment. It's individualised practice. You will not see the word social justice. You will not see the word challenge. You will not see anything other than like a solicitor should be. You should be able to trust what I do. But you know what? It's not about anything wider than my delivery of services to you, if that makes sense. And there are lots of things about having complaints made against me, which is right if I'm not doing as well within that. But I say the focus is a real problem in relation to where social justice and things like community work come within that for social work. Whereas, if we look at the International Federation definition, social work is a practice-based profession. Principles of social justice, human rights, collective responsibility and respect for diversities are central for social work. So underpinned by theories of social work, social sciences, humanities and indigenous knowledges, social work engages people and structures to address life challenges and enhance well-being. Does that fit very well with our professional codes and education and kind of things? Social work's an academic discipline that strives to alleviate poverty, liberate the vulnerable and oppressed, and promote social inclusion and social cohesion. Okay, I'm going to go over the rest of that, but that first sentence there, I think there's a real challenge for social work in England at the moment because it's very difficult to be carrying that within our codes and our education at the moment. So, final slide. Key areas currently influencing social work policy and practice. The mixed economy, retreat to the welfare state with new non-public and private providers. Personalisation of services linked to consumerism and individualised packages of care. Oh, just one little example actually. One of the difficulties about this individualised thing and passing power down, we now have things where, as a service user, I can be given money to buy my own services. Okay? So if I'm someone at home with disabilities, I will have money to employ a carer. Oh, bit of a problem, because actually, one, I've got to know how to employ someone, and what if they're not doing very well? How do I deal with that when I'm dependent on them? And recently, someone in that position sacked their care worker. The care worker took them to an employment tribunal because they were seen as the employer and sued them for not going through correct discipline procedures. Now, if I'm a vulnerable person, how am I meant to act in that sort of way? I put that as a question for us, please. Issues of service user involvement in services, empowerment, co-production, both in my own care plans and how that happens, but in terms of policy, we're seeing that more and more. I think that's a good thing, but there are some criticisms too. Issues about care management and supporting independent living. That's the important bit. We moved some years ago away from big institutions that were seen as expensive to care in the home. Good care in the home can be more expensive maybe sometimes than certain forms of institutional care. Adult and child safeguarding, risk assessment and risk management related to targeting of clients and resources. And again, I think a good one, developments in anti-discriminatory and anti-oppressive practice. Thank you very much. So any questions, thoughts or comments, please?
Thank you very much, Brian, for your fantastic contribution to our conference debate, and I'm pretty sure that it will give a rise, the beginning to very engaged discussions, and I'm ready to run to share my mic with you. So any questions, comments, please?
Okay, thank you, Brian. I've never understood what does it mean to be a practice-based discipline. I think it's a cardinal mistake to define social work in this way. I think it should be theory-based. And social work cannot develop as a discipline if we emphasize this formulation, practice-based. But how do you understand? What's the point there? What does it mean?
Thank you, Juha. I think probably I would take a stance, it's about theory, but also value base. I think our value base as social workers is absolutely crucial. And in terms of what that means for a practice base, in the end, I would like to see it so that our students graduating go out there and do a damn good job for some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people in our societies. Now, how we get to that point is the debate. And that's why our government have been pushing us in different ways. So you lot, you talk too much about sociology, you talk too much about social justice. Just teach them how to get on with the job. Now, the problem with that is you are not reflective. You cannot change. So say it changes in what you do. I haven't got the capacity to understand the bigger picture to locate what I do within that, but also the research base as well. Now, one of my concerns about the frontline programme, and I'm an external examiner for it. I was persuaded to be external examiner to try and keep up standards, all right? But it's very, very focused on certain ideas. Now, those ideas may change. I think as social workers, we need to have a wide range of ideas, not just those even very specific within individual work ways of doing it, if this makes sense. So we have to understand larger things about society, about organisations, than sometimes we get in those very therapeutically based, if you can call it those courses. So I think we are a practice-based profession, and should be. The problem we have in England is working sometimes with agencies and practitioners who don't think that there's a wider world to look at. I am so busy, how do I take into account research? How do I try and remember my values? Who do I talk to get support to do this when I'm under big pressure just to keep going to do these things and processes that my agency asks me to do? Just one point on that I meant to mention was the practice-based profession. One good thing for us maybe at the moment from some of the bits this morning about academia and things, we are judged in universities about our research output, okay? And it used to be just how many articles have I had published in the British Journal of Social Work or whatever, European Journal, whatever. It's now changed, and the government are saying we'll only give you this high marks and a tiny bit of money for it if you can demonstrate impact. So 40% of how we are judged now in these exercises, can I show that what I have done has made a difference in the wider world, in practice, in policy, which I think is probably quite a good thing. But it still doesn't answer that point about how we link up theory, values, research and practice, because I think we're doing it pretty poorly in England at the moment, if I'm honest. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments, please?
Hello, good afternoon, Brian. Thank you very much for the clear and very interesting lecture. I knew Hertfordshire when it was a College of Further Education, because I did my CQSW a bit further than your college.
Did you say you have a CQSW?
Yes.
Me too.
Thank you.
Good, please.
How would you explain when I, as a social worker, earning 22,000 a year, and my next door neighbor come all the way from Africa, and they are getting 37,000 per year, and every 2 years their family increases by a child. Thank you.
Was that in terms of salaries, yes, or in terms of...
No, my salary.
Yeah, okay. And the
family... And my next door neighbor,
yep,
who comes from Africa, has already got 4 children, but every 2 years they have another child and another child.
Sorry.
And their total income from benefits,
yep,
is 37 to 40,000 a year. They have got a better car than I have, and I'm still driving my old VW.
Okay, thank you. And if, from my understanding is this family on benefits? Not a social worker, yes? So on benefits. That's interesting because in terms of the government announcements, they're saying no family should get more than £20,000 a year from all benefits. So that's kind of interesting in itself. And I don't know how you get the information of how much money that family get. But in terms of that, I think there are two issues really, is that whatever we think about that, I wouldn't want any child to go without, because I can't choose my parents, nor can anyone. So I don't think any child should be in poverty, for example, because of that. The issue about salary levels, I think, is a rather different one. And we all think social workers should get paid more. But there have been a number of discussions in our country recently, haven't there? And I've never seen how it works through in practice. But to make sure that people get a good income, even if they're on their minimum wage. So if they have children, to make sure you're better off in work than not in work. Whether that works in practice or not, I don't know. And I'm not sure that really answers your question, but that's the best that I can do.
Okay. Does someone have another question or remark or comment?
I would have 3 questions. The one is, listening to all these circumstances and conditions for social work in UK, I would like to ask you, is there any movement of critical social workers in UK? This is the first question. What's about a multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach of social work in UK? And the third one is, what's about participatory approach of the clients or the service users? How are they involved in the quality of services, and is this a question for social work as well?
Thank you. I'll see if I can remember all of those. So I'm going to go in reverse order because I could... Red card. Red card? That means I've got to stop altogether, Aldrich. Oh, I've been sent off like David Beckham. Okay. When I get excited, I speak faster, and my colleagues tell me I have to slow down. So, I'm not sure I can remember your first question, but we'll start off with the last one first, please. This, I think, is a real potential for a paradigm shift in our country. So, professionals, not just social workers, we think, because of all our training and our background, we know best for people. This is the basis of it, really. And this movement, and it's becoming part of government policy now, interestingly, in mental health services, to say that we should, as far as possible, not only co-produce our plan of intervention, our assessment of plan, with individual service users and their carers, which I think should always have been happening. And actually, that's where I think the task-centred approach has always been quite good. In that way, we say, what do we think it is? How do we work? How do we know if we've got there or not? So I think that can be useful in these individually based approaches. But it's more than that, much more than that. It's also about how, if I'm a mental health service user or carer, how am I involved in saying what the issues are, whether it's a good service, how it should change, and we're starting to see some elements of this now. And as I say, it's now government policy. So National Health Service England, the executive body, in its mental health plan 2 years ago said, we will be looking to make sure that all services in mental health agencies will be co-produced with service users and carers. Now, we thought there's a massive shift forward from the work that we'd been doing. The reality is rather different, but the really important bit is that we are now working, in my work with those mental health trusts, and it's not just me by any means, I'm a very small part of all this, but we're starting to see a change. Very little is now discussed in big, big agencies without service users and carers being there. Yep, this is a massive change. We've got a long way to go yet, because you can have a big board meeting with 40 professionals and 2 service users. I don't think that's co-production. I'm not going to find it very easy to contribute to this and challenge. So we've got a long way to go yet, but I'm quite pleased we see these things. But we have to be careful that it's not tokenism, as we call it. Yeah, we're doing it. Yeah, we're doing it. Look, we had 2 service users sitting in our big meeting when they didn't feel able to contribute or really be part of it at all. So that's the last one. Interprofessional working, I think I remember that one as well. is a huge feature of what we do now. In our child protection services, we have to show how we're relating. I'm not sure it's maybe the best model, but in every area, mental health, it's foregrounded. We are measured on it. In the inspection regimes that I mentioned earlier, both for adult care, for health services, for children's services, the inspection team comes in and they're very powerful. They can close me down. If I'm a local authority, they can close me down, my children's services, and send someone in to take it over. It's that powerful. If I'm not meeting the requirements, one of those requirements is that I can demonstrate I'm working effectively with the health services, the police, whoever else. Sorry, you. Yeah. So for children, it's called, yeah, I'm sorry, folks, it's Ofsted, and it's a government agency, and they will come along every few years, and they will go through everything that I do. They have access to all of my files, all of our staff, to our service users and carers, and they will make a judgment whether I'm excellent, good, or poor. And if I'm poor, and they come back again a year later and find it the same, they can literally, if I'm the head of the agency, they will sack me and put a civil servant in to take it over. So it's just it's good. Of course we have to do interprofessional working. We have problems about sharing information sometimes, but it's a government requirement, for better or for worse. Making it work in practice might be slightly different, but I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Okay.
Critical social work.
Social work, yeah. Is there any movement about critical social work?
Well, if you go and sit with a social work team, there'll be plenty of critical things being said about their work and how it is. Don't think that's critical social work. That's feeling critical of how my job is in the main. Yes, there is, but very little. I think that most social workers now feel as though they're having to work so hard and in such pressurised circumstances that there's little time to have energy to do anything above their day job. Now, but I think you'll find that's what will come back mostly. When we've done studies about that, they feel very stressed in this way. So I'm not, my other colleagues here might have some other things to say about that, but there's a very good professional association, highest number of members they've ever had, so it will do things in that way. But I would say in terms of a tradition and in academia, the critical social work bit isn't nearly as big as it was in the 70s and 80s. But others might disagree. Jim.
Okay.
Swan, indeed, yes. Yeah. But it doesn't have a big influence on employers. Or, I would say, Jim, on most social workers, I'm afraid.